In Canada, we're part of an incredible tradition of philosophy, if you will, of classical liberalism. It's based on peaceful cooperation, individual freedom, and small government. But are we now at risk of losing that tradition? Yes, that same tradition that has lifted billions out of poverty and into prosperity the last 200 years. So we're going to talk about that today with our next guest.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So, with me here today to talk about this philosophy or tradition of classical liberalism is Dr. Eamonn Butler, and I want to warmly welcome you from the UK, from London, England. Welcome, Eamonn.
Hello, it's very good to be with you again.
Well, Eamonn, it's a delight to see you, and we've got lots to talk about as we talk not only about understanding this incredible tradition, but also understanding the context today as we talk about this in 2024. So help us understand the basics of classical liberalism. And you've written an incredible book, and I recommend it to our audience. It's called Classical Liberalism, a Primer. And you wrote this, and I just love the book because it's so readable and it's brilliantly concise. But I guess one of the key things I realized is that freedom enables prosperity. Is that kind of the bottom line?
Oh, it's the foundation of prosperity. Absolutely right. It's the world economy, the free market economy, the great progress made in North America in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. All of those things were built on liberal values, classical liberal values in the traditional sense, not in the American liberal sense. And it was that which enabled people to be free enough to take risks, to invest their own money, to start up businesses, to trade freely with other people. And that generated the wealth, which has continued to grow and is still being generated today. So liberal values are absolutely fundamental to economic progress.
So it's interesting as well that in the book you go back into the history and how this tradition didn't just simply happen overnight. It happened over almost 1,000 years, going back to the Magna Carta. In fact, I know that the institute that you're president of, the Adam Smith Institute, did this brilliant documentary about the Magna Carta. Can you tell us more about that history and why that was an important moment in Western civilization?
Well, it actually goes back about 1,000 years before the Magna Carta. It was really the Anglo-Saxon tradition in England thousands of years ago, where basically kings were elected. They didn't govern by right; they were elected, and there was a council of wise people who would elect them. And the philosophy was very much one of you looked after yourself and your family, and you got on with it, and you collaborated with others, and that's a basic principle in classical liberal thinking. What happened, of course, is that in 1066 we were invaded by the French, who had a feudal system. And there was a reaction to that somewhat later, a couple of hundred years later, in 1215, where English aristocrats really got together and basically made the king sign a petition that guaranteed their rights. So it was that which informed British politics for the next 500 years. And when the Americans went to North America, what is now the United States, and also they went to Canada, of course. They were really armed with the Magna Carta. They thought of themselves as being the true inheritors of Magna Carta, and that King George III had messed it up. So that's so there's a very deep tradition that exists throughout the English-speaking world now.
So what I find fascinating is that in the book you brilliantly summarize this type of history, that this happened over a long period of time, and it was really kind of a sense of respect, a deep respect, that individuals should be empowered to run their own lives, and that the king, as important a role that is to ultimately serve the people, not just serve themselves, and that no one was above or below the law. And so I think that these are kind of almost assumptions that we take for granted. Do you think that's a common problem in our society, where we take these rights and freedoms, this tradition, for granted?
I think it's a grave danger, actually. It's I always think if you asked a fish how is the water, the fish wouldn't even know that there was water. It's so natural a part of the fish's life. It doesn't even think about it. And I think that we suffer from that as well. That we have all of these institutions. We have the mostly we have a rule of law, and we have toleration of other people, and individual freedom, and a court system that is impartial, and so on and so on. So all of these institutions and traditions and principles of a free society exist here, and we just think that we can sort of impose those on the rest of the world, and well, you can't. We went in England, we went through many hundred years of bloodshed and civil wars in order to come up with our present parliamentary system, for example, in which the monarch is not all powerful, and the executive is answerable to the people through parliament. That it took a lot of doing, and there was progress, and then there was regress, and then was progress again, and there's regress. So it's not an easy process, and it's one of these things where it's kind of so subtle. You don't really know what really makes the difference and what doesn't. What institutions are really important, and which ones are just sort of important. So you just have to discover it for yourself.
Indeed. So let's touch base on, I think you summarized well, 10 key principles that really make up this grand tradition of classical liberalism. And the first one is the presumption of freedom. What do you mean by that?
Well, that you can act however you choose, provided that you don't harm other people. That's the essential. The no harm rule is the key thing. I can swing my fist in any direction I like, unless your nose happens to be in the way, in which case that should limit my action. So people should be free to act in any way they like, to say what they like, to meet with whoever they like, to practice whatever religion or culture they like, and provided they're not doing demonstrable harm or threatening imminent harm to other people. And many of us think that has to be physical harm, because anybody can say, oh dear, I'm being mentally harmed by this action or that person. Many of us think that it would have to be the threat or imminence of physical harm, which would stop you acting any way that you like. And that, of course, produces a very diverse society in which people act in different ways and do different things. But that itself is productive, because we all spark off each other. We're all doing different things in different ways, and we learn from other people that works better than the way I do it, and so on and so on. That's how you make progress.
So does that freedom, that presumption of freedom as you've outlined, does that include freedoms of speech and freedom of thought? I mean, that's foundational for the progress and the ability of society to move forward, isn't it?
Well, you are obviously free to think whichever way you like. There's nothing I can do to stop you thinking the way you like. In terms of free speech, yes, absolutely. And John Stuart Mill, the English philosopher of the 19th century, talks about this very, very accurately and persuasively, saying that even if somebody is in a minority of one, they still have the right to express their opinions. And he says, after all, you might not like their opinions, but their opinions might be right. Or perhaps bit of their opinion is right, and perhaps you can learn from that. And unless people come forward with different ideas, you'll never make progress, because progress is an evolutionary thing. It's you need to feed it with as many ideas as possible in order that the best ones come to the surface, and you've got a variety of ideas for different circumstances. When circumstances change, then you can fall back on other ideas. Whereas if you've only got sort of one idea and the state enforces it, and you're not allowed to criticize it or question it, then you're in a very vulnerable position, to be honest, because you're not making progress. You can't make progress. And if circumstances change, you've had it. You've got an idea that doesn't work necessarily.
But Eamonn, this is a profound point that enables us to not only succeed as a society, but I would suggest that this is part of what defines us to be human. We're presumed to be free, and that means we can think what we think. We can have freedom of speech because it's a sign of respect for other human beings. And this is a complete contrast with what I call the emergence of totalitarians who want to censor you or even criminalize freedom of speech. I mean, if you don't think about certain ways of a certain narrative, like whether it's about climate change or transgenderism, or whether it's about claims regarding, in Canada, mass graves, I mean, there's an effort to criminalize this kind of presumption of freedom. I mean, isn't that kind of disturbing?
This isn't a matter for the law. This is a matter for people. And if you say something which I find extremely offensive, then I will tell you I find that extremely offensive. And unless you change your views, I don't really want anything to do with you. Or perhaps I might say, well, I think you really ought to reconsider your position on that, because I think you're wrong. And here's why I think you're wrong. And with lots of people doing that, then eventually we learn to moderate our opinions, perhaps, but also to respect other people's views, and to not cause gratuitous offence, but to be able to express our own views in ways in which we say, well, you may disagree with this, but this is my point of view, and here's why I believe it. If you start criminalizing speech, then you get one standard view, and the law, which is very clumsy. The law is an exceedingly clumsy thing, particularly when it's done through legislation rather than through the courts. And so the legislators come up with something. Well, how do you define what's offensive and what isn't offensive? Is a racial slur offensive, or isn't it? Or does that cause harm to people, or not? And so you get this very specific line. And it's actually even worse than that, because it's what then happens, of course, is that the police, they try to police all these things, and they end up. Well, we had a case just a couple of weeks ago where a journalist made a remark on Twitter about Palestinian demonstrations. It turned out to be wrong, so she immediately deleted it, but somebody complained, and then the police a year later turned up on her doorstep saying, well, somebody's complained, we can't tell you what they complained about or why they complained, but they complained.
And this is in the UK, so you already have, case in point, police showing up on people's doorsteps because you did the wrong tweet. I mean, this is absurd.
Yes.
So I think part of this, though, is that they are using the pretext, those who seek to limit freedom of speech, by saying, well, it's not just offensive, it's hate speech. So help us define what the heck is hate speech in this world where, well, you could say anything that's offensive is hate.
Well, there's no such thing. Yes, you can say things which offend people. And as I said, it is then for those people that find themselves offended, and for their friends and other people and independent folk who might think you've gone a bit far. It's for them to say, well, I think you should moderate your language here. That's just not right to call people by some racial slur or whatever. And it's not for the law. Once you get the law involved, then you get into a complete tangle of courts and police and
Hmm.
procedures, and everybody involved has an interest in building the thing up.
Hmm.
Nobody that's involved in it wants to see less of it. The police don't want to see less hate crime going on, because then they wouldn't have a job and so on. And the politicians want to show how thoughtful they are and so on.
But what strikes me about this conversation, Eamon, is that it underlines the importance in a high functioning society, one that is both able to humbly look at the world of ideas and say that we may not all have the truth, and that we should not
Yeah.
consider ourselves, dare I say, gods. We should be humbly able to tolerate different perspectives and have that kind of healthy debate. That's an important part of building a better society.
Yes, and this is how science works. That we don't know what is true. You don't sort of intellectually know how the universe works. You just have to come up with a theory, and then you test it against the facts. And if it fits, in, then that's absolutely great. And if it doesn't, then you abandon it and do something else. And you've got to have exactly that same mechanism in to make social progress as well. That you have to try things, and if they don't go down well, you do less of that, you do more of something else. So for social progress, it's just like scientific progress.
Hmm.
You have to allow people to put forward theories, even if you think they're completely crazy and nutty. But
Hmm.
there may be some truth in them somewhere, and some of the leading scientific discoveries have been people putting forward theories which sounded completely crazy at the time, but which turned out to be.
So I think you're spot on. And I think it's remarkable you made the point that, well, if we don't presume freedom, including things like freedom of speech and that kind of respect for that diversity of opinion, then you don't have science. And then if you don't have science, gosh, as a society, we're kind of punted back to the Stone Age. So it is truly quite a very seminal point. The second principle that you outline is the primacy of the individual. What do you mean by that, Eamon?
Well, there are many political theories which start with the idea that well, we've got a collective of people, and the important thing is to make sure that the collective prospers, and so on and so on and so on. And the liberal takes a completely different point of view, saying that's the wrong starting point, because the collective is simply a collection of individuals. It's neither
Hmm.
more nor less. It doesn't have a sort of identity of its own. It's just a collection of people. So what you really need to do is to make sure that individuals are prospering, and that's why you need to look at them as being the prime focus of your law and your morality, and all the rest of it, because then free people will certainly try and look after themselves and their families. So um, your political outlook should be encouraging that and promoting that,
Hmm.
rather than having some overview that we must have policy which directs the whole society in one direction or another. So it's a sort of philosophical point of where do you start in terms of analysing society, and the answer is you start with the individual. That's what society is all about.
So is that also a sign of, again, profound respect that all individuals are unique? I mean, we don't have the same DNA. We don't all think alike. We're individuals, and we don't just lump people into groups like identity politics. Is that kind of the contrast here?
Well, that's a very, very good point, yes, that you make. And this is, I mean, it's one of my great disappointments well, if you take something like race, for example, I mean, certainly here in London, I mean, we were getting to the situation where uh, people's color, racial background, whatever, was neither here nor there. We didn't even, we were getting to the stage that Martin Luther King dreamed of, where we didn't even notice people's color.
Yes,
And
exactly.
now, of course, you have to, and you have to make special provisions for different groups, and so on and so on. And you think, oh, this is racism in another way, and I
Hmm.
don't think it's remotely healthy. You should treat people, as well as Luther King said, for their character, judge them on their character, not the color of their skin or any other irrelevant characteristic. So yes,
Exactly.
I think this is a really important point, and we must treat people as people, treat them for what they are, treat them for how they deal with us, treat them for their character and their integrity. Not for any other thing, which is really irrelevant to the discussion. Where they come from, their history, and so on. Indeed even their culture and beliefs and so on. It's not relevant to how they behave as individuals, as members of a functioning society.
Yeah, so I like that vision that we treat people based on that they're precious individuals. We treat them for things that are important, not some kind of secondary characteristic. It doesn't really matter. What matters is, well, are they able to do the job? Are they able to be people of good character? I mean, it seems to me that that's a great, important vision to uphold. The third principle that you talk about, Eamonn, in the book is the principle that we shouldn't use coercion in society. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean, people should be free to act how they like without facing the threat of theft or violence or intimidation from others. And that's really why we established governments. We established governments in order to protect us from criminals at home and aggressors abroad. So we have a defense system and we have a justice system which is designed to limit coercion, because coercion, forcing people to do things, we think is a bad idea. And the classical liberal would say that yes, most people can get along with each other perfectly well, but there are a few who will quite willingly exploit others and will force them to do things, or will pressure them into doing things, or will threaten them with violence in order to get their own way. So that coercion really must be minimized. So that's why we set up a government as a sort of protection scheme to protect ourselves against that. And we give our government the monopoly of coercion. Say, well, yes, you can put people in prison, but nobody else can do that. You can wield a gun, but nobody else can. So it's well, that doesn't work in America, in the Americas, of course, but it certainly works here. That the police authorities can do things that ordinary citizens can't, in order to protect us. That's their function. And that's really their sole function. That's exactly why they're there. They're not there to push us around and boss us and get us to eat less calorific food or anything like that. That's not part of their brief. Their brief is to keep us safe.
All right. So you can use coercion, but in very, very limited cases out of protection. But what about this whole idea that, well, as we build a better society, as we build our utopia, Eamonn, that the ends justify the means. So we've got to use coercion. We've got to use the force of law to go after people, all in the name of building a better society. So you don't really buy that, do you?
No, I mean, you can use coercion if people are harming other people. And as I say, I think it has to be demonstrable physical harm, actually, before I start believing it. But if people are harming others, right, that's when you step in and say, sorry, mate, you're not going to be able to do that anymore. You're going into slammer. So, that's what state coercion is all about. It isn't to say, well, we think that people should drink less fizzy drinks, so we're going to make the bottles smaller. It's not about, we think that smoking is very bad for you, so we're going to stop people from smoking, or we're going to stop people consuming alcohol, or we're going to stop people gambling. All of these things. That's actually got nothing to do with the state. That's not what the state is there for. That's not why it was created. It's created to save us from other people's violence, and not to save us from ourselves. We can look after ourselves. And again, this is a matter for individuals rather than for governments and police forces. That if you think that somebody is I mean, I have friends that I think smoke too much, and I say, I think you're smoking too much, and you should
Hmm.
look after yourself better. And so I might suggest ways in which they might do that. But it's for their friends and other people to do that, not for the government to say, "I'm sorry, we're going to ban it and you can't do it anymore."
Okay, that makes a lot of sense, Eamon. The fourth principle that you talk about is that we bring an attitude of tolerance, that it's not enough, and we kind of alluded to this earlier around freedom of speech. It's not enough to just be offended, so you can shut down speech. Is that what you're getting at?
What I'm getting at is that we're all individuals, and none of us are quite the same. We don't think the same way. We have different views on politics, philosophy, religion, economics, and we have different cultures, and we have different religions, and we're diverse in so many different ways. And that's great because you can cooperate and collaborate with people who are different because they may have strengths that fill your weaknesses and vice versa. Or you may have a venture where you can both bring something to the party.
Hmm.
So it's great to have a diverse society because a diverse society can be extremely productive. But what it does mean, of course, is that you've got to tolerate other people's diversity. You've got to tolerate their actions, and you've got to tolerate their views and their morality and their religion. Rather than just saying, "Well, my religion is the right one, and I'm going to visit violence on anybody who says otherwise." So
Hmm.
that's what toleration is all about.
Well, I almost want to chuckle because there's so many universities in Canada that teach children today, even in young adults, but also in the larger school system, that there's such a thing as microaggressions. Have you ever heard of that phrase in the UK, Eamon, where there's microaggressions? And how dare you, well, I don't know, show up on time, and that somehow that's a racist act, and that you should be tolerant of, well, just everything. I mean, it's almost like this is an absurd redefinition of to be offensive. So, how do we handle this principle in a world of microaggressions?
Golly, now there's a question. Um, well, I think that we tolerate other people's behavior, and that if we don't like it, we say we don't like it. And I think that we should be free to say that we don't like it.
Hmm.
And I suppose if you turn up late for work, then I would say, well, I don't like that very much. Don't keep doing that, otherwise there'll be trouble. And that seems to me to be perfectly reasonable. Yes, I mean, right. I think it's of course perfectly right that we should be conscious of how we're perceived by other people, and therefore you do want to make sure that perhaps the language that you use is sympathetic to other people's views and so
Hmm.
on, and who they are and their status and gender or race or whatever it is. And you don't want to be gratuitously offensive. And if you are offensive, then people ought to be able to say, "Yes, I find that offensive. Please stop doing it," and then you might do less of it. And that idea, of course, goes right back to Adam Smith with his first book, the Theory of Moral Sentiments, where he says we're
Hmm.
social beings. We like to get on with each other. And if we do something and other people don't like it very much, well, we think, "Oh dear,
Hmm.
I've offended these people. I'm going to do less of that." And that's how
Hmm.
morality evolves, because it's the social pressure on us which gets us eventually to do the right thing. And that's good for society because it means that we can all collaborate together peacefully. Whereas if you're looking at your over your shoulder all the time and thinking, "Oh, I've got to give a lecture, and what words can I use, and what phrases can I use, and so on," well, it's a very difficult way to run your life, but
Hmm.
it's also counter progress because American professors have said this to me. It used to be a great joy to go into the staff common room or cafeteria, and you would say something completely outrageous, and everybody would have a good argument, and actually you'd learn something from the argument. uh,
Hmm.
and you'd know that your position was extreme and silly, but you'd learn why it was extreme and silly, or you would learn that, well, actually, there's a little bit of truth in this crazy idea of mine.
Hmm.
And now they say, well, you can't do that at all because people would find it offensive, and then so you can't actually have any discussion. Well, if you don't have any discussion, you don't have any progress. Just as if you don't have a variety of scientific theories, then you've got nothing to
Hmm.
choose between. You don't make any progress because there's nothing there. There's no grist in the mill.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, and to use a kind of another analogy, how do you create progress in society if the wheels of innovation are you're constantly throwing sand in the wheels because you're just grinding it down because everybody is afraid of offending somebody else? I mean, it's an absurd position, isn't it? We've got a lot of challenges that our society faces. So we need healthy debate more than ever and a kind of a tolerance. So I think that's, again, another critical principle. The fifth principle that you talk about is the importance of limited and representative government. And I guess it's the assumption that government power and legitimacy, I think John Locke talked about this an awful lot, is legitimacy of a government comes from the people and not from the state. Is that what you're getting at?
Yes, there are two things. Firstly, yes, that's right. That the government basically comes into being because we, as individuals, a collection of individuals, a group of individuals, we set up a government in order that it has a monopoly of coercion. It can protect us against bad guys
Mm.
from home or abroad. So that's why we set it up. Why it should be representative government is because, as we have learnt over the millennia, and it was obvious to the Romans and it was obvious to the American founding fathers, that if you have every law decided by the whole of the population, well, it's a very cumbersome system for a start. Particularly today, it would be almost impossible to do that. But secondly, you get some really weird decisions being made. And what you do, therefore, is that you elect people to take those decisions on your behalf. Most people have much better things to do than to bone up on the details of, I don't know, farm production or raising pigs or whatever. And that's why we get politicians to do that work for us, so that they become expert on different issues, and they can make a more rational judgment than we
Hmm.
can on those issues. So we empower them to do that on our behalf, and that's why you have representative government. But the representatives do actually have to represent you. They don't have to
Yeah.
follow exactly what you think, but they have to use their judgment in saying, well, I think this would benefit my electors
Hmm.
rather than something else. So that's why it has to be government, but representative government.
So in 2024, is that principle, I find this particularly challenging because the whole idea of having elected representatives in charge seems to me to be, gosh, so difficult to pursue simply because the administrative state, the power of the bureaucracy is just everywhere. I mean, they're regulating every aspect of our lives. It's gone frankly over the top. Is that a concern that you share?
Yes, this is something which our previous Prime Minister, Liz Truss, is extremely strong on. And she makes the case that ministers these days are mere ciphers, that they don't actually
Yeah.
decide things, that the bureaucracy decides it, and they're simply the front guys that go out and sell the policy, if you like. And she says, this started back in the 80s, really. It's in here. It started with Tony Blair, his government, and just empowering the bureaucracy, allowing regulators to make really quite serious decisions that could close down a business. For example, I was in a
Mm-hmm.
Foreman's, an important fish processing business in London just this morning, and he was telling me, right, inspectors could come around right now, and they could see something wrong and close the place down. And you think, wow, that business has been going for 100 years, and somebody can, from a bureaucracy, can come in and just close it down, without any
Mm-hmm.
politician taking any decision on it. And you think that's just gone too far. And things like our central bank, the Bank of England, again, it decides large portions of economic policy without any ministers being involved. It's
Mm-hmm.
independent of the government, or supposed to be. And so many other bureaucracies are exactly the same. And environmental protection and all of these sorts of things. All the decisions are made by the bureaucrats. So that has gone far, far, far too far. And I think it's a priority for any incoming, certainly conservative government in this country, UK, to do something about that. But I think other countries have some of the same problems. Maybe Elon Musk will sort out the United States, but I don't know.
Indeed. Well, it seems like a priority agenda across many nations around the world, particularly in Canada, the United States, the UK, is that the administrative state is just frankly not being managed by elected officials. It's like the elected officials, as you're alluding to, are really figureheads. They're not really in control as we rack up endless deficits and debts. And this is a huge problem because if you care about not just simply representative government, they're not in control, but it's also related to our prosperity. I mean, in Canada, we have not balanced our budget for over a decade now. It's really quite disturbing because all that will be inherited by not just the current generation, but the next generation. So this becomes almost like a moral hazard, does it not, Eamon?
Oh, I think it's completely immoral. Yes, that a government can borrow and say, right, well, the next generation can pay it off. I mean, their argument is always, well, the next generation will be richer than we are, and so they can afford it.
Mm-hmm.
But once you get into that kind of mentality, then you find yourself just spending and spending and spending, because there are so many people who are pressuring you to spend. There's no limit to the number of
Mm-hmm.
people who think that they should be supported by government or protected against competition by government or whatever, and that they're entitled to particular benefits and such and such. You can spend the entire gross national product on just appeasing interest groups. So once you have government borrowing, that is a problem. I mean, these were big debates in America. When it was founded. There were big debates in England during the 19th century as to whether, and 18th century, as to whether government should be able to borrow at all.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think that it needs to balance its books, and it needs to balance its books over a fairly short period of time. And uh, but once you get into the, it's just like any household. Once you start saying, well, I think I can just borrow, I can afford that, I
Mm-hmm.
can borrow it. Eventually, you end up that you're in debt, and you have to cut up your credit cards because you can't go on like that anymore.
No, I think you're onto something. We almost need to have legislation that forbids governments from borrowing money in the long term. And yeah, because they just cannot resist as elected officials and state officials to using more and more money to build a bigger state and to, frankly, try to appease all kinds of special interest groups. So I think you're onto something. The sixth principle that you talked about is the importance of the rule of law. Is that what John Adams meant? We are a nation of laws and not of men?
That's exactly right. Yes, that the difference is that who is telling you what you can do and what you can't do. Is it a law which has gone through a certain process? It's been announced, it's been discussed, it's been debated in public. It goes into the legislative system, and it's examined by committees, and it's maybe examined by different houses of your legislature, and so on and so on. And eventually, it goes in, and maybe president or the monarch has to sign it, just to make sure that everybody's in complete agreement about this. So, are you governed by that kind of system in which, when you act to prevent people from doing certain things and say that this is a punishable offence, that's gone through a certain process, a due process? Or is it something where you allow individuals, possibly even one individual, to say how the country should be run and what people can do and can't do? So it's a difference indeed, absolutely right, between being ruled by laws and being ruled by men or indeed women. So that's the key difference there. And part of the thinking of the rule of law is that the people who make the laws have to be have to respect those laws themselves. They can't be above the laws. When Mrs. Thatcher came to office in the UK, we had what was called Crown immunity, which meant that anything like a hospital, say, or a school that was run by the government didn't have to follow the same standards as a private
No
institution.
kidding.
And you think, well, that's absolutely lunatic. If a private hospital has to scrub its floors, once a day, well, why shouldn't they? Why should the government not have the same obligation? That's just a total discrimination. That's part of it. That nobody is above the law, and that's the key part really of the rule of law.
Wow, that sounds good. So the rule of law in Canada is complicated, I think, because there's a new philosophy that's coming in, and that's basically that judges have the authority to kind of make up the law because they're so wise that they're able to massage or change the law in a way that tries to achieve equal outcomes for society. It's kind of a socialist version of law. Do you think that's a good idea?
Well, I think pretty obviously, I think it's an extremely bad idea. I think that you've got a sort of judicial intervention in these things, really, because we've got too much law. If your laws are simple and clear, then it's obvious what the answer is and
Hmm.
what they mean and what it means to obey them.
Hmm.
If they are hugely complicated, as modern laws tend to be, I mean, many are hundreds or even thousands of pages long. They're so long that nobody that's governed by them will ever read them. How could they possibly read all the laws? And then of course, then you get judges who are just like bureaucrats taking power on themselves and saying, well, I think Parliament may have passed the law for this purpose, but really, it should be applied to produce greater equality or whatever.
Hmm.
And they would argue that, well, greater equality, that is more just outcome. Well, no, that's not what the law is there for. It's not what the law is about. And
Hmm.
you should respect what it is that the legislators were trying to achieve in the law, rather than what some judge thinks should be done. So
No,
yeah,
that
I
makes
mean,
a lot of sense.
yeah, I mean, again, I think this is a very serious problem. We have it as well here, judicial activism, and I'm utterly against it. Yes, and it causes a lot of tension and distress.
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. If judges want to be activists, maybe they should what is it again? Oh yeah, run for office and become elected. Um, so let's talk about the seventh principle, and that's about the importance of recognizing spontaneous order. What do you mean by that?
Well, it's quite simple that people can generally get along with each other just fine, and they do that in a way which actually produces a well-functioning society. Think about things like, think about animal societies like bees or termites or whatever, very complicated societies. But
Hmm.
somehow it just evolves. It just occurs. It's not that there's some chief bee that's giving everybody orders as to how they should act and so on. It's a spontaneous interaction between all of the different participants.
Hmm.
And the same is true of human institutions like language, for example. Nobody invented language. It just grew because it was rather useful to have
Oh.
language, and it evolves because then you can express more complicated ideas, which is even more useful. And then you have things
So,
like
Eamon, a
mathematics.
government commission didn't. So, a government commission, Eamon, you're saying, didn't come up with grammar. Grammar kind of evolved.
No, it's hard to believe, isn't it? But that is absolutely right. Yes, it just like Topsy, it just growed on its own, and the market is another one, of course, where again nobody designed the market, nobody nobody laid down how people should trade goods and so on. They just did it themselves,
Hmm.
and eventually, in the course of trade, then you get prices emerging, and the prices are a sort of signal as to which goods are in short supply and which are in excess supply. So you know whether to make more or make less, or buy more or buy less. And
Hmm.
so that again produces an overall order which is spontaneous. It's not an order that arises through somebody giving out commands. That's the point. It's
Hmm.
order, but it's not a commanded order. We tend to think that if something is orderly, well, somebody must have arranged that. Somebody must have
Right.
organized that.
Hmm.
No, you can have plenty of order, and in animal societies and indeed in human society, that is everywhere. In fact, that you have
Hmm.
orderly systems, but it's not they're not systems that people have consciously designed.
Hmm.
So look at whether you really have to intervene in a system or not. Whether you're actually improving it by intervening, and
Hmm.
are you making the market better by
Hmm.
having, I don't know, wage and price controls, say? Probably not, because that market has evolved over the millennia,
Hmm.
and it's probably got a great deal more, if you like, wisdom in it than
Hmm.
there is in your head.
But I think this makes a lot of sense. This point kind of respects that people as individuals have a freedom to innovate and do what's best for them and to work together in community to peacefully cooperate and
Yeah.
create something that's very innovative and frankly complex, and no government central planner will ever understand it. And so it's kind of bringing a humble attitude to bear that a lot of things in society are fairly complex because there's a myriad of decisions. The number is just truly amazing that define how people work together as human beings. And I think you used the analogy of the beehive.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, it would be impossible for a politician to design everything. I always think when I go through King's Cross Station,
Hmm.
with platform 9 3/4 and all of that kind of stuff, and there are people who come in different entrances, and they're going to different trains, and then they're coming out of
Yeah.
different trains and going to different entrances, and you think, how could you possibly organize all of that lot so that people didn't bump into each other? But in fact, they
Hmm.
manage themselves so they don't bump into each other. And
Exactly.
the management, the planning is done at the local level. It doesn't have to be
Hmm.
done at the global level, at the collective
Right.
level. And so, let that work, let that
Hmm.
operate. Give people the freedom to do
Hmm.
that rather than try and tell them how to run their lives. Because once you start intervening in these things, and say, well, you should be over there and you should be over there,
Hmm.
uh, then the whole thing just falls to pieces.
Exactly. But I think it's a very exciting point of wisdom. It's a principle that can help guide better public policy. At Frontier, we often refer to things like subsidiarity, the whole notion that if you're going to make a public policy, try to move it as close to the individual, the local level, as possible. Don't have some faraway central government try to control things because they don't know what's really going on in your life. So try to move things as close to the person as possible and empower them to live their lives the best they can for their their family and for themselves. So I think this is really quite an exciting principle. The eighth principle, as you've alluded to, is about property, trade, and markets. Um, can you tell us more about why that's such an important principle?
Hmm. It's I think it's a sort of, matter of fact. I mean, it's one of these things that you look at successful societies, and they're basically all capitalist societies where there is clear ownership. And the thing is that in a market, you see what happens is people trade goods. They swap one thing for another. We get confused because people swap goods for money and money for goods and so on. But actually, what they're doing is really swapping one good against another.
Mm.
I need a haircut, and tomorrow I'm going into the barber, and I'm going to get a haircut, and I shall give the barber some money, and the barber will probably use that to buy lunch. So I'm really swapping a haircut for a lunch. And when we do that, the barber and I are both better off. The barber might have got the
Hmm.
money, but I want the haircut more than the money, and he wants the money more than the haircut. So we're both actually better off. Again, this goes right back to Adam Smith in the Wealth of Nations, 1776,
Hmm.
where he says that's the key thing about trade. It generates value. Look at two kids in a playground and they swap toys. I'm fed up
Hmm.
with this toy. Would you like it? And I'll have yours that you're fed up with. Both of them get something that they prefer out of nothing's been created. There's nothing new. It's the same toys, but they're both better off. Value has been created. So
Hmm.
markets do that. They create value. They give us satisfaction that wasn't there before, and so you should allow them to get on and do that. And if people cannot have ownership over their own property and they can't decide the goods that they own, how they can use them, how they can exchange them, how they can sell them, just get rid of them, um, then that system doesn't work. So, good, clear property rights are absolutely essential to making markets work, and markets are absolutely essential to increasing human value.
Okay, so I think that's again another essential point is that there's this relationship between having clear property rights, freedom, and prosperity, and you can't move forward as a society if your government is saying, well, yeah, you quote own that property, but we're going to put these thousand conditions on the use of that property. Can you?
No, I think that's absolutely right, and it's very interesting the work that Hernando de Soto has done in Peru, looking at property rights where you have informal um, uh, property rights and so on. And he's saying, well, if you can actually formalize those more and give people an actual legal right over the house that they may have occupied forever, but it isn't sort of legally theirs, give them that property, and then things just go to the stars because they can use that property. Then they can borrow on it, and they can start a
Hmm.
business or whatever. So you have to have very clear property rights. It's one of the problems about environmental policy. It's not that it's that capitalism causes environmental damage. On the contrary, what the problem is that there aren't proper markets in environmental goods. I mean, environmental resources are scarce, like lots of other goods, and other goods are, if you like, rationed by the market. The market decides or the market shows you the most rational way of using these things. But that doesn't really happen in environmental policy. And what happens is, of
Hmm.
course, that governments come in and say, "Well, we must regulate how what pollution standards there are and things like that," rather than trying to build markets that would induce people to pollute less or to exploit more. And there are things like the Icelandic fisheries where they have tradable permits. So you set the quota of sustainable fishing levels, and you give people licenses to fish their little bit of that, and they can trade those licenses, which means that the most efficient people will go out fishing, and the least efficient people will find something else to do, and your fisheries will be protected. But at the same time, your fishing will be extremely effective and efficient. So that's a gain all round. So we really need to look for more ways in which we can apply market principles to environmental problems.
That makes a lot of sense. So we're getting in the home stretch here. We're on principle number 9, which is civil society. What do you mean by that?
Well, I mean all of those um, groups and collaborations between individuals. Churches and clubs and associations and religions and all of these groups have very positive things to deliver to society. It doesn't all have to be the government.
Hmm.
This was an obsession of the Soviets, of course. You had to get rid of religion because it was something contrary to the government. The
Hmm.
government wanted people to do one thing, and religion was driving them to do something else. So what's the solution to that? Well, let's get rid of religion. We'll close down the churches and so on and so on, and make it very difficult to practice your religion. So these groups are extremely important because, as you say, it's a case of taking responsibility for life down to the lowest possible level. You take it down to the level of individuals, and you take it down to the level of groups of individuals. And they come up with ways of doing things, and there are different ways of doing things. So again, you get choice and variety, and you can make progress because there's that diversity of different ideas. But I mean, for example, we used to in the UK before the 1940s, we had actually quite a good working system of working class welfare. We had what was called the friendly societies, and people. My father was one of them. He was just a mechanic, but he paid in, and my mother paid in to a sort of provident fund, and that would, if you were off sick and so on, that would help you, and if you died, it would pay for your funeral, and it would help you another way. And it was a working class system, and there were dozens of these different schemes, and many of them were very local, so they had a real grasp of what local people really needed in terms of the sort of social insurance and so on. And then that was all swept away and replaced by a state system, which of course has to work by rules, and you either
Hmm.
qualify or you don't qualify. They can't treat you as an individual; they have to treat you as a statistic.
Hmm.
And so what you get now with these sort of statewide welfare systems is you get people worsening their circumstances in order that they qualify. And you think that's the complete opposite of what you want to do. Whereas
Hmm.
the free system, the market system, if you like, would encourage people to do the right thing, and you would know
Hmm.
that if you acted in a certain way that was positive, then your contributions would be less or something like
Hmm.
that. And so that was an incentive to keep yourself healthy or whatever. And so again, I think that's an absolutely essential sort of
Hmm.
tool for running a good society. Let people do it. Let local organizations do it.
But I look at that and I think, wow, what an incredible tradition. Certainly in Canada, we have a long history of innovative civic society associations, whether it's through communities of faith or not for profits that work together in a caring way to improve our society. And I think that's an incredible tradition that we don't want to lose. And then finally, you talked eloquently in your book, Eamon, about the importance of common values in our society. What do you mean by that?
Well, I had to make it up to 10, of course, so maybe that's not a very good one. But what I mean is that I think there are some fundamental values that we need to agree on. I was just having this conversation this morning where I was pointing out that my wife and I if we'd met on social dating, we wouldn't have been compatible at all, because our interests and likes are entirely different. She's sports mad, and she's theatre mad, and I hate these things, for example. But at the same time, we've been together for nearly 40 years because we agree on some fundamental values about life, and the importance of life, and the importance of family, and the importance of honesty and right and wrong, and the way we live, decently, and we agree on trying not to offend other people, and trying to get on with people. These are fundamental values that are liberal values, and and we respect other people, whether they may be doing a menial job, and yet it's an important job because it helps society to run. They might be, cleaners in a shopping mall or whatever, but we all benefit from that work. So you give them the respect that is due to them. You don't treat them as if they're an inferior class of some sort. So these, I think, fundamental values, these liberal values, are absolutely essential, and we really need to rediscover and teach these values. I think we value today so many trivial things, or we're told to value so many trivial things that aren't really fundamental values, and then you lose sight of what is really fundamental. And it's like teaching in schools. Okay, the kids can do all sorts of things that I couldn't do in school, but at the same time, nobody's teaching them how to be decent human beings. And I think that is absolutely essential.
I like your eloquent summation of the importance of common values, Eamon, and it strikes me that your emphasis that we should renew ourselves in these principles and those values in our society by teaching the next generation is so critical. And yet it seems like our education systems are just doing the opposite, teaching a different set of values. So I think that gives us some clues in terms of the actions by which we can take. And one of the things that was really quite a great insight in your book is that these principles have been really foundational for pulling billions of people out of poverty the last 200 years and punting them into the world of prosperity. So these are things that we can't take for granted. These are very important principles. Are you concerned that these principles are in jeopardy now?
Well, in a sense, yes, because I think those of us in the woke West, as I say, we're so fortunate to have all of the institutions of a free society that we forget their value, and then we start to dismantle them. On the other hand, I look at the world and it's getting better. And it's getting better largely because of market principles, because of liberal principles, because particularly since the early 1990s, possibly the late 80s, but really from about 1991 onwards, countries like India and the countries of the Far East became members, if you like, of the international trading system. They'd been closed off before with protectionism and all the rest of it, and they started to open up. And the same with various African countries and so on. And what's happened is that, we've had globalization, and people in the West complain about that and say, oh well, we're riding a bulldozer over these poor countries. No, that's not what's happening. What's happening is that once poor countries are becoming much richer, and the poorest people within those countries are the ones who are becoming better off quicker than others. And for much of my life, in fact, I think probably all of my life until the 1990s, roughly 4/5 of the world's population lived in $1 a day poverty. And now that is a tiny number, mostly in sub-Saharan Africa. The rest of the world has become part of the liberal free market trading system, or at least market. I'd like it to be freer than it is, but it's a market trading system, and we're benefiting from that. We in the rich countries benefit from having goods from all around the world. Similarly, people in poorer country will gain from the better quality that they can get from goods that come in from countries like Canada or Britain. And so everybody, again, is better off. And the people who are really made better off are the poorest. And to me, that's what it's all about. It ain't about equality or whatever it is. It's about making the poorest people better off. Adam Smith thought exactly the same. He wasn't, a promoter of the boss classes. On the contrary, he thought they were a complete shower. But what he was interested in is the ordinary working person and making them better off. And that's why he believed in free markets and a liberal economy. And that's why I believe in free markets and a free society as well.
Well, that's a brilliant summation, Dr. Eamonn Butler, the president of the Adam Smith Institute in London. We're so grateful that you could join us for this conversation about 10 key principles of classical liberalism and how we can't take those for granted in 2024.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.